The moment the entire ballroom started laughing was the moment I realized exactly what kind of room I had walked into. I was standing there in a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit my shoulders, holding a glass of water I didn't even want, while a woman worth more money than I could imagine was being seated right next to me like it was some kind of punchline. Someone at the table actually whispered loud enough for me to hear, "Perfect, the billionaire gets the charity seat tonight." A few people chuckled. One man even clapped slowly like the whole thing was entertainment. The woman beside me, Victoria Hale, the billionaire CEO, everyone in that room practically worshipped, looked confused at first, then slightly annoyed. But me, I had been in rooms like this before. Rooms where people decided who you were before you ever opened your mouth. Rooms where a black single dad like me was automatically the joke. The funny thing is, none of them knew the truth. None of them knew why I was actually there. And none of them knew that by the end of that night, the same people laughing at me would be staring in stunned silence. So let me ask you something before I tell you how all of this happened. If you were sitting in a room full of powerful people who clearly believed you didn't belong there, would you stay quiet and let them laugh? Or would you wait until the right moment to show them exactly who they were dealing with? My name is Marcus Reed, and if you had met me a few years ago, you probably would have thought the same thing those people in the ballroom thought. Just another working class guy trying to get through life one paycheck at a time. A man raising his daughter alone. A man who spent most of his days fixing things other people broke. And in a lot of ways, that description wouldn't have been wrong. Because the truth is, my life really did look simple from the outside. I lived in a modest neighborhood on the south side of the city, in a small house with creaky wooden floors and a porch that needed repainting every spring. It wasn't much, but it was ours. And when I say ours, I mean mine and my daughter's. My daughter Layla was the reason I woke up every morning, determined to keep going no matter how hard things got. She was 9 years old at the time all of this happened, with bright, curious eyes and the kind of imagination that could turn a cardboard box into a spaceship. Being her father was the one role in my life that I never doubted I was meant for. Everything else, jobs, money, status, that stuff came and went. But being her dad, that was permanent. Her mother had left when Layla was barely 2 years old. I won't go into every painful detail, but the short version is that she decided she wanted a life that didn't include responsibility. She said motherhood felt like a cage to her. I remember the night she told me she was leaving. Layla was asleep upstairs, clutching a stuffed rabbit she refused to go anywhere without. I stood there in the kitchen, listening to the woman I once loved explain why she needed freedom more than she needed us. It broke something inside me that night. But the next morning, when Layla came downstairs asking for pancakes, I realized something important. My pain didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the little girl depending on me. So I got up, learned how to braid hair from YouTube videos, figured out how to pack school lunches that didn't embarrass her in front of her friends, and built a life around making sure she felt loved every single day. During the day, I worked as a maintenance technician for a property management company that handled several commercial buildings downtown. My job wasn't glamorous. Most days I was dealing with clogged pipes, broken lighting systems, or elevators that refused to cooperate. But I was good at it. My father had taught me how to fix things when I was young, and that skill turned into the kind of steady work that kept our lights on and food on the table. Still, life in our city had a way of reminding you where you stood on the social ladder. There were neighborhoods where people drove luxury cars and lived in houses bigger than entire apartment buildings. And then there were neighborhoods like mine, where people worked hard just to keep up with rising rent and grocery bills. And sometimes there were moments that made the gap between those worlds painfully obvious. One of those moments happened the day I first heard the name Victoria Hale. I was repairing a broken air conditioning unit in the lobby of a high-rise building when the security guard started talking about a business magazine cover featuring her. According to him, she had become one of the youngest female billionaires in the country after taking over her family's investment firm and turning it into a powerhouse. People described her as brilliant, ruthless in negotiations, and nearly impossible to impress. At the time, I barely paid attention. People like Victoria Hale lived in a completely different world than people like me. Or at least that's what I thought. Life has a strange way of crossing paths that we're never supposed to meet. The first time I actually saw her in person wasn't in a boardroom or on a magazine cover. It was at a school science fair. Layla had spent 2 weeks building a project about renewable energy using little toy wind turbines and recycled materials. She was incredibly proud of it, even though she kept worrying the other kids' projects would be better. The day of the fair, parents and judges walked around the gymnasium examining all the displays. I was standing next to Layla's table when a tall woman in a navy blazer stopped to look at her project. She asked thoughtful questions about how the turbines generated electricity. Layla explained everything enthusiastically, waving her hands in the air like a tiny professor. The woman listened carefully, smiling in a way that seemed genuinely impressed. Before leaving, she told Layla something I'll never forget. Never stop building ideas like this. The world needs people who think differently. Then she walked away. Only later did another parent whisper to me that the woman was Victoria Hale, one of the event sponsors. I shrugged it off. To me, she was just someone who had taken the time to encourage my daughter. But a year later, everything changed. It started when the property management company I worked for was contracted to handle maintenance for a luxury hotel hosting a massive charity gala. Apparently, it was one of those high-profile events where wealthy donors, corporate leaders, and politicians gathered to raise money while networking behind the scenes. My supervisor asked if I could stay late to help ensure everything ran smoothly. I agreed. Most of the evening, I stayed in the background fixing minor issues, adjusting lighting equipment, repairing a faulty stage microphone, things like that. But at one point, the event coordinator approached me with an unusual request. They were short one seat at a donor table because a guest had canceled at the last minute. The coordinator explained that someone from the staff needed to fill the spot temporarily to avoid leaving an empty chair during the televised portion of the gala. And somehow, that someone became me. They handed me a suit jacket that belonged to a staff member who had left early and told me to sit quietly, smile if cameras passed by, and not draw attention to myself. Simple enough, or at least that's what I thought. When I walked into the ballroom, the lights, music, and sheer extravagance of the event made it clear I was far outside my usual environment. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Tables were covered in white linen and decorated with elaborate centerpieces. People dressed in expensive suits and gowns moved through the room like they owned the air they breathed. And then I saw the name card at the seat I was supposed to take. Victoria Hale, the coordinator, had accidentally, or maybe intentionally, placed me at the same table as the billionaire. That's when the laughter started. Some guests clearly recognized me as staff. Others simply assumed I was out of place. And just like that, the joke began. Victoria arrived a few minutes later. She looked at the empty seat beside her, then at me. For a brief moment, I thought she might ask for someone to move me. Instead, she sat down and said quietly, "Looks like they've decided to make us neighbors tonight." Her tone wasn't mocking. If anything, she sounded amused. But the people around us weren't amused in the same way. They thought it was hilarious that the richest woman in the room had been seated beside someone they assumed was nothing more than a random nobody. Little did they know the night was just getting started, and by the time the truth about me came out, the laughter in that room would disappear completely. But before I tell you how that happened, let me ask you again what you would have done in my place. Because sitting there beside a billionaire, while powerful people laughed quietly behind their champagne glasses, wasn't exactly how I expected my evening to go. And the truth about who I really was, well, that revelation was about to turn the entire room upside down. The first thing I noticed after Victoria sat down beside me was that she didn't look at me the way everyone else in the room did. Most of the people around that table had already made their decision about who I was. You could see it in their smirks, in the sideways glances, in the quiet little laughs that slipped out when they thought I couldn't hear them. But Victoria didn't do that. Instead, she studied me for a moment like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Then she leaned slightly closer and said quietly, "You don't seem very bothered by all this." I shrugged and kept my voice calm. "I've been underestimated before." She raised an eyebrow at that, clearly intrigued. But before she could say anything else, the host of the event stepped onto the stage, and the room slowly quieted. The gala was officially beginning. Now let me explain something about rooms like that one. When you're surrounded by people with money, influence, and power, the atmosphere becomes something different from the real world. It's almost like everyone is performing a version of themselves. Smiles are sharper, laughter sounds rehearsed, and every conversation feels like it has an agenda hiding underneath it. I sat there listening to speeches about charity and opportunity, while waiters moved between tables pouring wine that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. The irony wasn't lost on me. A room full of people raising millions of dollars for struggling communities, while quietly laughing at the one man in the room who actually came from one of those communities. Victoria eventually turned to me again during a break in the speeches. "So," she said softly, "what do you actually do?" I could have lied. I could have said something impressive, something that would make the people around us reconsider their assumptions. But that's never been my style. I fix things, I told her, mostly plumbing, electrical systems, elevators, whatever breaks. She nodded slowly like that answer meant more to her than it should have. That's honest work. One of the men sitting across from us, a guy with slicked back hair and a suit that probably cost more than my truck, laughed into his drink. Well, someone has to keep the pipes working while the rest of us build the economy. The comment drew a few chuckles from the others at the table. Victoria didn't laugh. Instead, she gave the man a look that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. The rest of the evening continued like that. Subtle jokes, quiet remarks, little reminders that in their eyes I didn't belong. But I had learned a long time ago that dignity isn't something other people can take from you, unless you let them. So I stayed calm, spoke when spoken to, and ignored the laughter. At one point, Victoria asked about my family. I told her about Layla. The moment I mentioned my daughter, something changed in her expression. Her posture softened slightly. "How old is she?" she asked. "9, I said. "She wants to be an inventor." Victoria smiled at that, and the smile looked genuine. "The world needs more inventors." The man across the table snorted again. "Maybe she'll invent a better plumbing wrench." That time I did look at him. Not angrily, just directly. Sometimes eye contact is enough to remind someone they're dealing with a human being, not a punchline. He looked away first, but what nobody realized in that moment was that the joke of the evening wasn't actually me sitting there. The joke was the assumptions everyone in that room had already made, and that's where the story really begins. Because the truth is, my life before that night wasn't as simple as people thought. Yes, I worked as a maintenance technician. Yes, I lived in a modest neighborhood and drove an old truck that rattled every time I turned the key. But what most people didn't know was that I hadn't always lived that way. There was a time years earlier when my life looked very different. My father, David Reed, had been one of the most respected engineers in the country. He specialized in infrastructure design, bridges, transit systems, power grids, the kind of work that keeps entire cities functioning. When I was a kid, I used to watch him study blueprints late into the night, explaining how every bolt and beam mattered. The strongest structures, he told me once, are the ones people don't notice until they fail. That lesson stuck with me. Our family wasn't wealthy in the flashy sense, but we were comfortable. More importantly, my father believed in building things that lasted. He started a small engineering firm when I was in high school, and over time it grew into something much bigger than he ever expected. But success attracts attention, and sometimes it attracts the wrong kind. When I was 24, my father died suddenly from a heart attack. The loss hit me harder than I can describe. Overnight, the responsibility for the company fell onto my shoulders. I was young, inexperienced, and grieving all at once. And while I tried my best to keep the business running, I quickly realized something ugly about the world of high-level contracts and corporate competition. Not everyone plays fair. Within a year, a series of legal battles and financial manipulations forced the company into bankruptcy. Investors pulled out, competitors swooped in, and just like that, the business my father had spent decades building was gone. The worst part wasn't losing the money. It was watching people treat my father's legacy like it never mattered. That was the moment I decided something about my life had to change. Instead of fighting endless legal wars with people who had deeper pockets and dirtier tactics, I stepped away from that world completely. I sold what little remained, paid off our debts, and chose a quieter path. I went back to the basics my father had taught me. Fixing things, building things, working with my hands, and eventually, that path led me to the job I had when this story happened. So when the people in that ballroom laughed at me, I didn't take it personally. They weren't laughing at the truth. They were laughing at a version of me they had invented in their own heads. The evening moved toward its main event, the charity auction. The host announced that the proceeds would fund education programs in underprivileged communities across the state. Ironically, the very kind of communities I had grown up in. As the bidding started, numbers flew across the room like confetti. $50,000, $100,000, $200,000. Applause followed every new pledge. Victoria remained mostly quiet beside me, watching everything carefully. Then something unexpected happened. One of the auction items was a partnership opportunity with a new infrastructure initiative, a project designed to rebuild aging public transit systems in several major cities. The host described it as a rare chance for investors to support a project that could change millions of lives. That was the moment Victoria leaned toward me and whispered something that surprised me. "Does that proposal make sense to you?" I blinked. "You're asking the maintenance guy." She smiled slightly. "I'm asking the man who fixes systems for a living." So I looked at the proposal details displayed on the screen. Within seconds I saw the problem, actually several problems. The design assumptions were flawed. The projected maintenance costs were unrealistic. And the timeline they were promising investors, nearly impossible. I leaned back and said quietly, "If they build it that way, it'll fail within 5 years." Victoria studied my face carefully. "You're sure? Positive?" She didn't respond right away. But the next thing she did made the entire table go silent. Because when the host asked if anyone wanted to place the opening bid, Victoria Hale raised her hand. And then she said something that nobody in that room expected. "I'll invest on one condition." The host smiled eagerly. "And what condition is that?" Victoria gestured toward me. "I want him on the advisory team." For the first time that night, the laughter completely stopped. Every head at the table turned toward me. The man with the slick hair looked like he had swallowed a lemon. And the entire ballroom suddenly wanted to know one thing. Why would a billionaire trust the opinion of a man they had all been laughing at just minutes earlier? And that's where I want to pause the story for a moment and ask you again the same question I asked at the beginning. Because if you were in my position, right, then sitting in a room where powerful people had just mocked you, and suddenly the most powerful woman in the room decided to trust you instead, what would you do next? Would you stay quiet and avoid the spotlight? Or would you finally tell them the truth about who you really are? Because the truth I revealed next didn't just surprise them. It completely changed the way that entire room saw me. And what happened after that? Let's just say the people who laughed the loudest earlier in the night became very, very quiet. For a long moment after Victoria said she wanted me on the advisory team, the entire ballroom felt like it had frozen in place. The same people who had been whispering and laughing earlier were suddenly staring at me like I had transformed into a completely different person. The man with the slick hair across the table leaned forward slowly and said, "I'm sorry, did you say him?" The host on stage looked confused too, glancing between Victoria and me like he was trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. But Victoria didn't look amused. She looked calm, certain, like she had already made up her mind. Yes, she said clearly, loud enough for the microphone to carry her voice across the room. Him. I felt dozens of eyes land on me at once, the kind of attention that normally only powerful people receive in rooms like that. I set my glass of water down slowly because suddenly my hands felt heavier than they should have. Not because I was nervous, but because I knew something important was about to happen. Victoria leaned closer and whispered quietly, so only I could hear. "You noticed problems in that proposal in less than 10 seconds. Most engineers would need an hour. Who are you really, Marcus?" That question hung in the air between us like a weight. Across the table, the slick-haired man laughed awkwardly, trying to restore the earlier mood. "Victoria, I'm sure the gentleman is very good at maintenance, but this project involves billion-dollar infrastructure planning." A few people chuckled again, but this time the laughter sounded forced, uncertain. Victoria didn't even look at him. Her eyes stayed on me, waiting. That was the moment I realized something my father used to say had come true again. The truth always arrives eventually. He told me once when I was young. The only question is whether you're ready when it does. I took a slow breath and leaned back in my chair. "You're right," I said calmly, looking at the man across from me. "Projects like this usually do involve billion-dollar infrastructure planning." He smirked, clearly expecting me to back down. "Exactly." Then I continued, "which is probably why the structural load calculations in the proposal are wrong." That got everyone's attention. The host on stage paused mid-sentence. Victoria folded her hands and watched silently. The man across the table frowned. "Excuse me." I looked toward the large screen displaying the project summary and pointed at one of the diagrams. That bridge support design they're proposing, the materials they listed can't handle the long-term stress of the transit load they're projecting. Within 5 years, the maintenance costs would triple. Within 10, it would need to be rebuilt. A murmur spread across the room. Now people weren't laughing. They were listening. One of the investors at another table stood up slightly and called out, "And you know this how?" That was the moment I knew there was no point hiding anything anymore. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. A few taps later, I turned the screen toward Victoria first. She looked down at it and her eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. Then she turned the phone so the man across the table could see. His smirk vanished instantly because on the screen was an old article from a national engineering journal. The headline read, "David Reed and Son Revolutionize Urban Transit Infrastructure." Under the headline was a photo of me standing beside my father, 10 years younger but unmistakably the same person. The room went silent. Slick-haired man blinked twice like his brain needed a moment to catch up. You're Marcus Reed," I nodded. Last time I checked. Victoria leaned back slowly in her chair, a small smile forming at the corner of her mouth. The Marcus Reed, she said quietly. Your father's firm designed 3 of the largest transit systems in the country. I nodded again. Before the company collapsed, now the silence in the room felt different. This wasn't the silence of people trying to hide their laughter. This was the silence of people realizing they might have made a very serious mistake. The man who had mocked me earlier cleared his throat awkwardly. But you're working as a maintenance technician. I shrugged. Systems break. Someone has to fix them. That line triggered something unexpected. A few people at nearby tables started whispering. They were pulling out phones, searching my name, finding the same articles Victoria had just seen. The realization spread across the ballroom like a ripple in water. Victoria leaned closer again, her voice low but amused. You let them laugh at you all night. I shrugged again. It wasn't hurting anyone. She tilted her head slightly, except their own reputations. The host on stage finally recovered from the shock and stepped forward with the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, it appears we may have an unexpected expert in the room tonight. A few people chuckled nervously, but this time the laughter wasn't directed at me. Victoria raised her hand again, commanding the room's attention without even trying. As I said before, I'll place the opening investment bid on one condition. The host nodded cautiously. And that condition remains the same. Victoria looked straight at me. Marcus Reed joins the advisory team. This time the reaction was completely different. No one laughed. Instead, several investors began nodding slowly, because suddenly the idea didn't sound ridiculous anymore. It sounded brilliant. The slick-haired man who had mocked me earlier leaned back in his chair looking uncomfortable. He forced a weak smile. Well, I suppose expertise can come from unexpected places. Victoria finally turned toward him, her voice polite but sharp. Or perhaps it was always there, and some people were simply too busy laughing to notice. That line landed harder than any insult could have. For the rest of the evening, the energy in the ballroom had completely shifted. People who ignored me earlier were now introducing themselves, asking questions about infrastructure, about engineering, about my father's work. And through all of it, Victoria watched quietly with an expression I couldn't quite read. Later that night, as the gala began winding down and guests started leaving, she walked with me toward the hotel entrance. The cool night air outside felt refreshing after hours under bright ballroom lights. She stopped near the steps and looked at me thoughtfully. You could have told them who you were the moment you sat down, she said. I could have. Why didn't you? I thought about that for a second. Then I said something my father once told me. Because the moment people learn who you are before they learn how you think, they stop listening. Victoria smiled at that. A real smile, not the kind she probably used in business meetings, you know, she said. When they placed me next to you tonight, they thought it was a joke. I nodded. But jokes usually have punchlines, she continued, and tonight I think the punchline surprised everyone. I laughed quietly. Even you, she thought about that. Then she said something that changed my life in a way I didn't expect. Especially me. Before getting into her car, she turned back once more. We're going to rebuild that transit project the right way, she said. And I want you involved. I crossed my arms slightly. You trust the maintenance guy that much? She smiled again. No, she said. I trust the man who saw what everyone else in that room missed. Her car drove away a few seconds later, leaving me standing under the hotel lights thinking about everything that had happened. But the biggest surprise of the night wasn't the reveal of who I was. It was the realization that sometimes the world doesn't need you to prove your worth loudly. Sometimes all it takes is one moment, one opportunity for the truth to reveal itself. And when it does, the people who once laughed are usually the first ones trying to shake your hand. Looking back now, I don't regret staying quiet that night while they joked about me, because if I had spoken up earlier, they would have listened out of politeness. Instead, they listened because they finally understood. So now I want to ask you the same question again. If you were in that ballroom and people assumed you didn't belong, would you have corrected them immediately? Or would you have waited for the right moment to show them who you really were? If you enjoyed this story and you were on my side tonight, go ahead and like the video, subscribe for more stories like this, and tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. And trust me, the night I was seated beside a billionaire as a joke turned out to be the beginning of a lot more unexpected chapters in my life. But those are stories for another time. I'll see you in the next one.